Chandrayaan-3 is expected to land on the moon on August 23rd. But space is hard, and moon missions are especially hard. With Chandrayaan-2's failure still fairly fresh, will Chandrayaan-3 prove to be a game changer for India? Hello and welcome to another episode of The Data Point. Today, we're talking about Chandrayaan-3. Chandrayaan-3 is the Indian Space Research Organization's third lunar exploration mission. So Chandrayaan-3 is made up of three different elements. The propulsion module, which is essentially like the engine, the Vikram lander, which has a few instruments and hosts the third element, which is the Pragyan rover, which is a robot on wheels which will explore the moon. All of these elements are equipped with instruments to conduct tests and experiments. Chandrayaan-3 began to circularize its orbit around the moon on August 14th to prepare for the landing. The Vikram lander is set to make a soft landing on the moon on August 23rd. Chandrayaan-3 is a follow-up to Chandrayaan-2, which was launched in 2019. Chandrayaan-2 had an orbiter, a lander, and a rover, and was meant to study the moon's surface and also identify water sources on the moon. But the mission failed. The lander crashed during its descent. Data shows that moon missions are particularly difficult to execute. 40% of all moon missions failed. Missions that aim to land a robot on the moon have a failure rate of over 60%. And missions that are meant to collect samples from the moon and bring them back to Earth have a failure rate of 67%. And to really understand how hard these missions are, consider this. Over the past 23 years, China is the only country that has managed to successfully soft land a robotic lander on the moon. Chandrayaan-3 is different from Chandrayaan-2. It has stronger legs, more power, and an upgraded landing sequence. The aim, this time around, is to successfully complete the entire mission. So let's take a look at the numbers. Here, we see that sample return, robotic lander, and impactor missions have the highest failure rates. On the other hand, flybys, rovers, and orbiter missions are generally more successful. I want to bring in our deputy science editor, Vasudevan Mukunth, to understand why lander and sample return missions are so hard. So Mukunth, can you explain the kind of challenges that these missions face?
There is no way to answer this concisely. So let me just quote the example of Chandrayaan-2. After the lander crashed on the moon's surface, and when the failure committee, came together and tried to figure out what had happened, they found that one of the problems was that when the lander was coming down, its thruster could change its output, in terms of the amount of force generated in certain increments, by increments of 20%. And they found that was too high. And in the current mission in Chandrayaan-3, that has been modified to 10%. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of things, the kind of eventualities that are possible when you're undertaking a robotic mission, where even when you're testing all the instruments on Earth, you are trying to look out for all the eventualities that are possible. But as you said, space is hard and there is no environment like space. So it really is not possible. So the best thing that you can do is equip it for stuff that you cannot even anticipate and hope for the best.
Okay. So missions aren't always complete failures. Some do manage to be partially successful. But when we do look at sample return and robotic lander missions, these two have the highest failure rate. I do want to note, though, that given their complex nature, sample return and robotic lander missions are undertaken less often than orbiter missions, which have the lowest failure percentage. So, Mukunth, can you explain what differentiates all of these missions?
For example, flybys. So you're just flying past an interplanetary body, and because you're flying past that body, you collect some data. So that's a flyby. You have impactor missions where, like, for example, that happened with Chandrayaan-1, where there is an orbiter and it launches something towards the surface of the body that it is studying. And in Chandrayaan-1, what had happened was the impactor threw up some dust, some moon dust, and which instruments on the orbiter then recorded and studied. So that's flybys, impactors, landers, of course, largely self-explanatory, and also rovers to a certain extent. Then there are orbiters, the Mars orbiter mission. So these are the various kinds of missions depending on what their goals are, what their objectives are. So just to give you an example, an impactor is a very rudimentary sort of surface mission, whereas a more advanced form would be a lander or a rover, which can go there and rove around. There are also sample return missions. So these are the different kinds of missions depending on what about these other planetary bodies that we want to study.
Okay, so how do we consider a mission to be a failure or a success? Because, for example, if we look at NASA's Apollo program, the lunar module for Apollo 13, Aquarius, is considered successful because all 3 crew members returned to Earth safely, even though they weren't able to land on the moon.
That's a difficult question. For simpler missions, it's easy to say what a success is based on whether or not it has achieved its primary objectives. So missions have primary, secondary, maybe even tertiary objectives. Technology demonstrator missions, for example, their purpose is to demonstrate certain technologies that have been developed and are being deployed in the field, so to speak, for the first time. So as long as those parameters are executed, as long as that system behaves the way it is supposed to behave, to a certain degree, whatever degree that is, then yes, you can, affix some kind of success or failure tag to it.
When we look at the number of lunar missions launched over the years and the failure rates, there are a lot of ups and downs. The 1950s saw high failure rates across mission types. In fact, all orbiter missions failed. The 1960s saw 74 moon missions, the highest for any decade so far. But the failure rate was still pretty high at 62.2%. The 2000s stood out because all missions succeeded. The 2010s also had a much lower failure rate at just 22%. But the number of unsuccessful missions went up again in the latest decade, and the overall failure rate rose to 47.1%. Even half the flyby missions ended up failing this time around. So what is next for Chandrayaan-3? I mean, what happens if it fails?
Yeah, so at one point, the lander will detach from the propulsion module and it will gently descend over the lunar surface. At one point, it will identify the spot at which it wants to land on. And even this part of the descent will be conducted in phases where after it descends to a particular distance, it will conduct another assessment of the landing spot, the intended landing spot, and see if it is still suitable. If it is not suitable, it will scout around for a potential alternative. And if and when it finds one, it will descend over to that spot. And again, after learning the lessons of Chandrayaan-2, the lander has been equipped with stronger legs, better landing sequence, and so forth. So this is what should happen. But as I said earlier, Chandrayaan-2 failed for a few reasons, and one of them was that they sort of misset the amount by which the lander could adjust its, the amount of force that its thrusters exerted. So hopefully such things should not come to pass, and it goes down, softly.
Okay, and what happens if it succeeds? What information do we get?
There are many implications. One is, okay, so this is a pretty important one. I mean, it has become of late, which is that if it succeeds, India will be only the 4th country to have achieved such a feat, where, robotic soft landing on the moon. And India will also become the 2nd country among the group of countries that have signed the Artemis Accords to have achieved this feat after the USA. So that will give it a lot of sort of influence, because it will have shown that it can master these technologies. It has mastered these technologies. And it will also put the country and ISRO on surer footing, in future, collaborations with other space agencies as well, that are intended to, land and explore the moon.
Mukunth, thank you so much for explaining this to us. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, please leave us a like and make sure you're subscribed to the Hindus YouTube channel so you don't miss the next one.